Hey guys, welcome back. Or maybe welcome for the first time. Either way, I am glad you are here. Go ahead and get comfortable. Adjust your pillows. Pull your blanket up a little higher. Maybe dim that phone screen if you haven't already. Tonight, we're going somewhere a bit different. We're not talking about inbred kings or Habsburg chins this time. No. Tonight, we're going to talk about machines. Ancient machines, the kind that really shouldn't have existed when they did. The kind that make historians squint at artifacts and mutter things like, "That can't be right." We're talking about gears that predate the Industrial Revolution by nearly 2,000 years. Automatic doors in temples, robots that poured wine, clocks that tracked the stars. All of this built by people who, according to our neat little timelines, should have been too busy dying of plague or arguing about philosophy to invent anything this complex. And yet, here we are, staring at the evidence, trying to figure out how they did it. And more importantly, why we forgot. So settle in. This is going to be a long one. We've got Greek engineers, Chinese automata, Islamic polymaths, and a very confusing lump of corroded bronze pulled from the Mediterranean Sea. Let's begin. Our story starts, as many good stories do, with a sponge diver and a shipwreck. The year was 1900. The place was a tiny Greek island called Antikythera, which sits in that stretch of water between Crete and the Peloponnese. It is the kind of place where the sea is impossibly blue, and the cliffs look like they were designed specifically for dramatic shipwrecks, which is convenient because that is exactly what happened there about 2,000 years ago. A group of Greek sponge divers, led by a captain named Dimitrios Kontos, were working the waters around Antikythera when a storm forced them to take shelter near the island. While waiting for the weather to clear, one of the divers decided to do a little exploratory dive. His name was Elias Stadiatis. He went down about 60 meters, which, by the way, is extremely deep for that era. Sponge divers were tough. They had to be. The job basically consisted of holding your breath, diving to dangerous depths, and hoping you didn't get the bends on the way back up. Many did. It was not a gentle profession, anyway. Elias went down, and what he found was not sponges. He came back up babbling about bodies, horses, women, all scattered across the seafloor. His crewmates probably thought he'd had a nitrogen narcosis hallucination, which was a common occupational hazard. But Captain Kontos decided to check it out himself. He dove down, and he saw the same thing. It wasn't bodies, of course. It was statues. Bronze and marble statues, corroded and encrusted with marine life, but unmistakably ancient. They had stumbled upon the wreck of a Roman cargo ship, loaded with Greek art and treasure, that had gone down sometime around 70 to 60 BCE. The ship had been carrying loot, probably headed to Rome, probably for some wealthy collector who wanted to decorate his villa with authentic Greek masterpieces. Because even 2,000 years ago, rich people were like that. The Greek government got involved. A salvage operation was organized. Over the next 2 years, divers brought up an astonishing haul: bronze statues, marble sculptures, glassware, pottery, coins, jewelry. It was one of the most significant underwater archaeological discoveries ever made at that time. Museums were thrilled. Scholars were ecstatic. Everyone patted themselves on the back. And then, almost as an afterthought, someone noticed a chunk of corroded bronze that had been pulled up with the rest of the debris. It wasn't impressive to look at. It was about the size of a shoebox, greenish-brown, covered in calcified sea crud. It looked like something you'd throw back. But someone, thankfully, decided to keep it. They brought it to the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, where it sat in storage for a while, because that is what happens to unimpressive lumps. They get put in storage. Then, in May of 1902, an archaeologist named Valerios Stais was examining the artifacts from the wreck. He was probably expecting pottery shards. Instead, he found himself staring at something that made no sense. Inside the corroded lump, he could see what appeared to be a gear wheel, a bronze gear wheel with triangular teeth. Embedded in ancient Greek technology, Now, you have to understand why this was confusing. In 1902, the historical consensus was that gear mechanisms were a medieval European invention, maybe Byzantine at the earliest. The idea that the ancient Greeks had built devices with precision gears was, to put it mildly, unexpected. It was like finding a smartphone in a Viking burial mound. It didn't fit the narrative. Stius proposed that the artifact was some kind of ancient astronomical clock. His colleagues were skeptical. Some suggested it was a medieval device that had somehow ended up mixed in with the ancient cargo. Others thought maybe the dating of the shipwreck was wrong. A few probably just shrugged and went back to cataloging pottery, because academia has always had a healthy population of people who prefer to ignore inconvenient evidence. And so the Antikythera Mechanism, as it came to be called, sat in the museum, studied occasionally, argued about intermittently, but mostly just existing as a weird footnote, a curiosity, a thing that didn't quite fit. It would take decades before anyone really understood what they were looking at. Let's float forward in time a bit, to the 1950s and 1970s specifically. This is when a British historian named Derek de Solla Price decided to take the Antikythera Mechanism seriously. Price was an interesting character. He was born in London, trained as a physicist, and somehow ended up becoming one of the founding figures of the history of science as an academic discipline. He was the kind of person who looked at problems sideways, who asked questions that other people considered either obvious or irrelevant. In this case, the question was, what if the ancient Greeks were actually capable of building complex mechanical devices? Price obtained permission to study the fragments of the mechanism. By this point, the original lump had been split into several pieces, and additional fragments had been identified among the wrecked debris. He used X-ray imaging to peer inside the corroded bronze, to see the gears that were hidden beneath the surface. What he found was extraordinary. The mechanism contained at least 30 interlocking bronze gears. Some of them were tiny, just a few centimeters across. They were arranged in a complex configuration that allowed the device to model astronomical cycles with remarkable accuracy. Price spent years analyzing the gears, mapping their relationships, trying to understand what the machine was designed to do. In 1974, he published a paper called Gears from the Greeks. In it, he proposed that the Antikythera Mechanism was an ancient analog computer, a device designed to calculate and display the positions of the sun, moon, and possibly the planets. A machine that could predict lunar eclipses, that could track the cycles of the Olympic Games, that could show you where celestial bodies would be on any given date. Built in ancient Greece, around 150 to 100 BCE, by someone whose name we don't know, using techniques we barely understand. Price called it the most complex scientific instrument to survive from antiquity. He wasn't exaggerating. But here is the thing that really gets me. The Antikythera Mechanism wasn't a one-off. It wasn't some isolated miracle. The level of precision in its construction, the sophistication of its gear trains, the elegance of its astronomical modeling, all of this suggests that whoever built it was working within an established tradition. They had predecessors, teachers, perhaps students. There was a whole language of mechanical knowledge that we've almost entirely lost. The mechanism is evidence of a technological lineage that we can barely trace. Like finding a single page from a massive encyclopedia and trying to imagine all the volumes that are missing. So who built machines like this? How did they learn? What other devices did they create? And why did this knowledge vanish for more than 1,000 years? These are the questions we're going to explore tonight. Slowly, gently, one ancient engineer at a time. Let's start with the Greeks. Because of course it is the Greeks. It is always the Greeks. Now, when we talk about ancient Greek engineering, we're not really talking about mainland Greece. Athens was great for philosophy and democracy and dramatic plays about people accidentally killing their fathers. But for actual mechanical innovation, you needed to go to Alexandria. Alexandria was founded by Alexander the Great in 331 BCE on the Mediterranean coast of Egypt. After Alexander died, which he did at the inconveniently young age of 32, probably from fever, possibly from poison, definitely from being Alexander the Great, his empire was carved up by his generals. Egypt went to a man named Ptolemy, and Ptolemy, unlike many conquerors, was interested in more than just military glory. He wanted to build a center of learning, a place where scholars from all over the Mediterranean could come to study, to debate, to write, to experiment. He founded the Maution, which is where we get the word museum. He established the Great Library, which became the largest repository of knowledge in the ancient world. Alexandria became a magnet for intellectuals, mathematicians, astronomers, physicians, and importantly for our story, engineers. The Ptolemaic dynasty ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years. And throughout that period, Alexandria remained the intellectual capital of the Mediterranean. It was diverse, cosmopolitan, a place where Greek, Egyptian, Jewish, and eventually Roman traditions mixed and mingled. It was also, frankly, kind of a mess politically. The Ptolemies were spectacularly dysfunctional as a family. Lots of sibling marriages, lots of murders, lots of dramatic poisonings. Cleopatra VII, the famous one, was the last of the line, and by her time the dynasty had accumulated centuries of accumulated drama. But none of that is really our concern tonight. We're here for the engineers, and the most famous engineer to emerge from Alexandrian tradition was a man named Hero, or Heron, depending on which transliteration you prefer. Let's go with Hero, because it makes him sound appropriately legendary. Hero of Alexandria lived sometime in the 1st century CE. We're not entirely sure of the exact dates. Ancient biographies are frustratingly vague about details like birth years and death dates. What we do know is that he taught at the Maution, that he wrote extensively on mathematics and engineering, and that he invented things that seem frankly impossible for his era. Let's talk about some of those inventions. First, the eolipile. This was a device consisting of a hollow sphere mounted on a pair of tubes connected to a boiling cauldron. Steam from the boiling water would enter the sphere and escape through 2 bent nozzles on opposite sides. The escaping steam would cause the sphere to rotate. It was, essentially, a primitive steam turbine. Now, before you get too excited, the eolipile wasn't powerful enough to do any useful work. It was a demonstration device. A novelty. Hero probably used it to illustrate principles of pneumatics to his students, but the basic concept using steam pressure to create rotational motion was sound. It was the same principle that would eventually power the Industrial Revolution. About 1700 years later, Hero just didn't have the metallurgy to build a proper engine, or the economic incentive, or the societal pressure. The ancient world had slaves for labor. Why build machines to do work when you had people? It is a grim thought, but it probably explains a lot about why ancient mechanical knowledge remained largely theoretical. But Hero didn't stop at steam. He also built automatic doors. Yes, automatic doors. In ancient Alexandria for temples. Here is how it worked. When a fire was lit on an altar outside a temple, the heat would cause air in a hidden chamber to expand. This expanding air would push water from one container into another, which was suspended by ropes. The weight of the filling container would pull the ropes, which were connected to pivots that opened the temple doors. When the fire was extinguished and the air cooled, the water would drain back and the doors would close. To worshippers arriving at the temple, it would appear that the doors opened by divine will when the sacred flame was lit. Magic. A miracle. Proof that the gods were present and attentive. In reality, it was just pneumatics and hydraulics, cleverly concealed. Hero wrote about this in a treatise called Pneumatica, which survives in fragmentary form. He described dozens of similar devices. Singing birds powered by water pressure, self-filling wine bowls, coin-operated holy water dispensers. Yes, that was a thing. You dropped a coin into a slot. It hit a lever, and a measured amount of water came out. Vending machines. In ancient Alexandria, he also wrote about automata, mechanical figures that could move on their own. One of his most famous designs was a miniature theater powered by a falling weight. The weight, connected to a series of ropes and pulleys, would drive a performance featuring moving figures, sound effects, and scene changes, all automatic, all running from a single falling counterweight. Hero wasn't the only one doing this kind of work. He was building on a tradition that stretched back at least 2 centuries before him. And at the foundation of that tradition was a man named Ctesibius. Ctesibius of Alexandria lived in the 3rd century BCE during the early Ptolemaic period. He is sometimes called the father of pneumatics, which is a nice title if you are into that sort of thing. His father was a barber, and according to legend, Ctesibius got his start in engineering by building a counterweight system for his father's shop mirror. The counterweight used a lead ball in a tube. When the ball fell, it pushed air through a narrow opening, producing a sound. Ctesibius noticed this and became interested in the behavior of compressed air. From that accidental beginning, he developed a systematic understanding of pneumatics and hydraulics. He invented the force pump, which used pistons and valves to move water under pressure. This design was used for firefighting in the ancient world and remained the standard water pump technology for nearly 2,000 years. He also invented the hydraulic organ, an actual musical instrument powered by water pressure. The water maintained constant air pressure, which allowed the organ pipes to produce steady tones. It was loud. It was impressive. Roman emperors loved it. Nero, famously, was quite fond of the hydraulic organ, though to be fair, Nero was fond of a lot of things that got him into trouble. Ctesibius also built what might be the most accurate clock of the ancient world, the clepsydra, or water clock. Earlier water clocks were simple devices that measured time by the flow of water from one container to another. The problem was that the flow rate changed as the water level dropped faster when the container was full, slower when it was nearly empty. This made the clocks inaccurate. Ctesibius solved this by using a regulator, an overflow system that maintained a constant water level in the supply tank, ensuring a steady flow. The outflowing water raised a float, which was connected to a pointer that indicated the time on a marked cylinder. The cylinder could be adjusted for different length of day throughout the year. It was, for its era, remarkably sophisticated. Unfortunately, none of Ctesibius's actual writings survive. We only know about his work through later authors who referenced him, Hero, Vitruvius, and others. His original treatises on pneumatics and mechanics are lost, vanished, like so much else from the ancient world. This is going to be a recurring theme tonight. We know these engineers existed. We know they built remarkable things. But the actual documents, the blueprints, the technical manuals, most of them are gone. We're reconstructing their knowledge from fragments, from copies of copies, from descriptions in other texts that were themselves copied and translated and recopied over centuries, with errors accumulating at every step. It is like trying to understand a language when you only have a partial dictionary and half a grammar book. You can make progress, but you are always aware of how much you are missing. Let's pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Adjust your position if you need to. We've established that Alexandria was a hub of mechanical innovation, that Hero and Ctesibius and others built devices that were genuinely sophisticated, that there was a tradition of engineering knowledge passed down through treatises and teaching that produced the kind of expertise necessary to build something like the Antikythera Mechanism. But Alexandria wasn't the only place where people were building machines. Not by a long stretch. Let's drift eastward for a while. To China. The history of Chinese mechanical engineering is both impressive and frustrating. Impressive because the achievements were remarkable. Frustrating because Western historians spent centuries either ignoring them or assuming they must have been exaggerated. They weren't exaggerated. They were just different. Chinese mechanical traditions developed independently of Greek and Roman ones. There was some contact along the Silk Road, of course, and ideas did flow in both directions over the centuries, but the fundamental approaches were distinct. Where Greek engineers loved pneumatics and hydraulics, Chinese engineers excelled at escapement mechanisms, chain drives, and precision metallurgy. Different tools, different solutions. Same basic human impulse to build things that move on their own. Let's start with the south-pointing chariot. This was a device that allegedly dated back to the legendary Yellow Emperor, around 2600 BCE. Now, that is almost certainly mythological. The Yellow Emperor is more of a cultural founder figure than a historical person, but the south-pointing chariot itself was real. We have historical records of it being built and rebuilt multiple times throughout Chinese history. What was it? Essentially, it was a chariot with a figure on top whose arm always pointed south, regardless of which direction the chariot turned. It wasn't a compass. There was no magnetic element. Instead, it used a differential gear mechanism, the same basic technology used in modern automobile transmissions, to maintain the figure's orientation. When the chariot turned, the differential gears would adjust the position of the figure so that it continued pointing in the original direction. As long as you set it correctly at the start of your journey, it would guide you south forever, or until the gears wore out. The earliest reliable historical account of a functional south-pointing chariot comes from the 3rd century CE, built by a man named Ma Jun. Ma Jun was one of those polymath inventor types that every civilization seems to produce occasionally. He improved silk looms. He designed irrigation pumps. He built mechanical puppets for theatrical performances. And he reconstructed the south-pointing chariot from ancient descriptions, proving that it was technologically feasible. The differential gear mechanism required for the south-pointing chariot is not simple. It requires precise machining, careful calibration, and a solid understanding of rotational mechanics. The fact that Chinese engineers mastered it by the 3rd century CE, possibly earlier, is significant. But the really impressive Chinese achievement in mechanical engineering was the astronomical clock tower of Su Song. Su Song was a government official during the Northern Song dynasty, living from 1020 to 1101 CE. He was one of those bureaucratic overachievers who managed to excel at everything. He wrote books on pharmacology. He served in various administrative positions. He conducted diplomatic missions. And then, in his 60s, he designed and supervised the construction of the most sophisticated mechanical clock the world had ever seen. The project was commissioned by Emperor Zhang, who wanted an accurate astronomical instrument for conducting official ceremonies at the correct times. Timing mattered in Chinese imperial culture. Rituals had to be performed when the stars were in proper alignment. A good clock wasn't just convenient, it was politically necessary. Su Song's clock tower was enormous, about 12 meters. It was powered by a water wheel with scooped buckets that filled and emptied at regular intervals, driving the mechanism forward in discrete steps. This is called an escapement mechanism. It is what turns the continuous flow of energy, in this case, falling water, into regular, measured movements. Tick, tick, tick. The same basic principle that makes mechanical clocks tick today. Su Song didn't invent the escapement. Earlier Chinese engineers, including a Buddhist monk named Yi Xing in the 8th century, had developed water-driven escapements for astronomical instruments, but Su Song refined and perfected the design. His clock tower could track the movements of the sun, moon, and stars with remarkable accuracy. It had multiple levels, each displaying different astronomical information. Mechanical figures would emerge at set times to announce the hours. It was a masterpiece. And then, about 30 years after it was completed, the Jin dynasty invaded. The clock tower was dismantled and carted off to the new capital. The engineers who understood how it worked were scattered. The knowledge of its construction was partially lost. When later dynasties tried to rebuild it, they couldn't quite replicate Su Song's achievement. This is the pattern, over and over again. Complex mechanical knowledge accumulated over generations, refined, perfected, and then disrupted by war, invasion, or simply the death of the people who held the knowledge in their heads. Su Song, at least, left behind a detailed treatise describing his clock tower, complete with illustrations. It is one of the most complete technical documents to survive from ancient engineering. We can actually understand, in reasonable detail, how his mechanism worked. That is rare, that is precious. But for every Su Song, there were dozens of engineers whose work left no written trace, whose inventions were described only in passing by later historians, who didn't fully understand what they were seeing, whose blueprints were lost in fires, floods, or simply the slow decay of paper over time. Let's talk about automata for a moment. Because the Chinese, like the Greeks, had a fascination with mechanical figures that could mimic life. One of the earliest accounts comes from a text called the Lize, which describes an encounter between King Mu of Zhou and a mechanical engineer named Yan Shi. This supposedly took place around the 10th century BCE, which is almost certainly legendary. The Lize was compiled much later, and stories about ancient mechanical men should be taken with appropriate skepticism. But the story itself is interesting. Yan Shi presents the king with a life-sized figure that can walk, sing, and dance. The king is amazed. Then the figure appears to wink at one of the king's concubines. The king, enraged, orders Yan Shi executed. Yan Shi quickly disassembles the figure, revealing that it is made of leather, wood, glue, and lacquer. No living spirit, just clever engineering. The king is even more amazed. He rewards Yan Shi instead of killing him. What is notable about this story isn't whether it actually happened. It probably didn't. At least not as described. What is notable is that it was told at all. It reflects a cultural awareness that such devices were theoretically possible. That skilled engineers could create things that seemed to blur the line between mechanism and life. That there was a tradition, even if partly mythological, of mechanical artistry. Latter Chinese automata were better documented. The Tang dynasty, which lasted from 618 to 907 CE, was particularly rich in mechanical marvels. One account describes a wine-serving figure built for the emperor, a wooden man that would fill cups and offer them to guests. Another describes a mechanical otter that could catch fish. Yet another mentions a monk who would beg for alms when a coin was inserted into his bowl. These descriptions come from court records and contemporary accounts. They're more reliable than legendary tales from the distant past. They suggest that by the Tang dynasty, Chinese engineers had developed sophisticated techniques for creating automata, springs, cams, linkages, probably techniques that have no direct modern equivalent, developed through centuries of experimentation and passed down through apprenticeship. And yet, very few of these devices survive. Materials decay, metal corrodes, wood rots, mechanisms break and are discarded. What remains are descriptions, hints, shadows of things that once moved and sang and poured wine. I find that rather melancholy. All those ingenious devices, built with such care, now existing only as words on pages. But let's not linger in melancholy too long. There is more ground to cover. Let's drift westward again, but not back to Europe. Let's stop in the middle, in the Islamic world, during what is sometimes called the Golden Age. The Islamic Golden Age is generally dated from around the 8th century to the 14th century CE. It was a period when scholars in the Islamic world made enormous advances in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, chemistry, and relevant to our story, mechanical engineering. The center of this intellectual flourishing was Baghdad, capital of the Abbasid Caliphate. In 762 CE, the Caliph Al-Mansur founded Baghdad as a purpose-built capital city, designed from the ground up as a seat of imperial power. Over the following century, it grew into one of the largest and wealthiest cities in the world. In 830 CE, the Caliph Al-Ma'n established the Beit al-Hikmah, usually translated as the House of Wisdom. It was a library, a translation center, and an academy of learning. Scholars were sponsored to translate texts from Greek, Persian, Sanskrit, and other languages into Arabic. Much of what we know about ancient Greek science and philosophy comes to us through this translation movement. Texts that were lost in their original Greek survived in Arabic translations made in Baghdad. Among the works translated were the mechanical treatises of Hero of Alexandria and other Greek engineers. These translations inspired Islamic scholars to build on the Greek tradition, to improve it, to take it in new directions. The most famous mechanical engineer of the Islamic Golden Age was a man named Ismail al-Jazari. He lived from 1136 to 1206 CE, and he served as chief engineer at the Artukid court in what is now southeastern Turkey. His magnum opus was a book called Al-Jami Bain al-Ilm wal al-Nafisina al-Hayal, which translates to something like the Book of Knowledge of Ingenious Mechanical Devices. Scholars usually just call it the Book of Ingenious Devices. And it is, without exaggeration, one of the most important engineering texts in history. Al-Jazari described 50 devices in his book: water clocks, fountains, automata, musical instruments. Each description included detailed diagrams showing how the mechanism worked, what materials were needed, and how to assemble the components. It was a practical manual, a blueprint collection, the kind of document that other engineers could actually use to build the devices themselves. Several of his innovations were genuine breakthroughs. He developed the camshaft, a rotating shaft with protruding cams that convert rotational motion into reciprocating motion. This is a fundamental component of modern engines. Al-Jazari used it in his water-raising machines and his automata. He designed the crankshaft mechanism for converting reciprocating motion into rotational motion, or vice versa, again, fundamental to modern machinery. He built segmental gears with teeth on only part of their circumference, which could engage intermittently with other gears to produce complex motion sequences. He created combination locks with programmable sequences. He designed automata that could perform complex, predetermined actions, like his famous elephant clock, which featured multiple automated figures that would activate in sequence to mark the hours. The elephant clock deserves a moment of attention. It was a water clock built into a model elephant, about 3 meters tall. On top of the elephant's back was a canopy with a figure of a phoenix. In front of the phoenix was a figure of a scribe with a pen, pointing at a disc marked with the hours. Other figures surrounded the scene: a dragon, a driver, and more. Every half hour, the water-driven mechanism would activate. A ball would drop from the phoenix's beak into a dragon's mouth, causing the dragon to tip forward. This would release water that would pull a cord, making the driver strike a drum. The scribe's pen would advance to indicate the new time. All of this happened automatically, driven by the slow drip of water through calibrated channels. It was visually spectacular. It was mechanically sophisticated, and it was multicultural by design. Al-Jazari explicitly incorporated elements from Arab, Persian, Indian, Chinese, and Greek traditions. He was synthesizing, drawing on the accumulated mechanical knowledge of multiple civilizations. This is what the translation movement made possible. By gathering texts from across the known world, by translating them and studying them and building on them, scholars in Baghdad and elsewhere could combine traditions that had developed in isolation. Greek pneumatics met Chinese escapements, met Indian mathematics. The result was innovation. Al-Jazari wasn't the only engineer of his era. The Banu Musa brothers, Muhammad, Ahmad, and Al-Hassan, were active in Baghdad in the 9th century, about 3 centuries before Al-Jazari. They wrote their own book of mechanical devices, which described over 100 automata and practical machines. Their designs included self-trimming lamps, automatic fountains, and various trick vessels designed to amaze dinner guests. There was also al-Muradi, who worked in Islamic Spain in the 11th century. His treatise on mechanical devices is partially lost, but surviving fragments describe complex gear trains and automata. Some scholars believe he may have used epicyclic gearing, gears that rotate around other gears, which would represent a significant technical achievement. The Islamic tradition of mechanical engineering continued for centuries. Water clocks became increasingly elaborate. Astronomical instruments became increasingly precise. The astrolabe, a device for measuring the positions of celestial bodies, was refined and perfected by Islamic astronomers. Some astrolabes included geared mechanisms that could model planetary motion. And yet, like everywhere else, the knowledge was fragile. The Mongol sack of Baghdad in 1258 CE was catastrophic for Islamic civilization. The city was devastated. The House of Wisdom was destroyed. Countless manuscripts were lost, thrown into the Tigris River, according to some accounts, until the water ran black with ink. Scholars were killed. Libraries were burned. Centuries of accumulated knowledge vanished. Some texts survived. Al-Jazari's book survived, which is why we know about him. The Banu Musa's work partially survived. But how much was lost? How many ingenious devices were never recorded in the first place, existing only in the minds and hands of craftsmen who passed their skills to apprentices? How many of those lineages were broken by war, plague, or simple economic decline? We don't know. We can't know. That is the frustrating thing about lost knowledge. You can't inventory what is missing when you don't know what was there. Let's take another breath here. Maybe close your eyes for a moment if you haven't already. We've traveled through Greece, China, and the Islamic world. We've seen that sophisticated mechanical engineering existed in all of these places, often simultaneously. We've seen that knowledge was accumulated, refined, and then lost, over and over again. But I want to talk a bit more about how knowledge gets lost, because it is not just about wars and fires. It is subtler than that, more systemic, and understanding it might help us understand why the ancient world could build things like the Antikythera Mechanism, and then seemingly forget how. Knowledge seems permanent. You write something down, and there it is, preserved forever. Right? Not really. Writing is just the first step. After that, the writing has to survive. The materials have to last. Papyrus crumbles, parchment rots, paper decays, stone weathers, even bronze corrodes, as we saw with the Antikythera Mechanism. Everything physical degrades, eventually. But even if the physical medium survives, the knowledge isn't safe. Someone has to be able to read it. Languages change. Scripts fall out of use. The ability to read ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics was lost for centuries until the Rosetta Stone was discovered and decoded. Linear B, the script used by the Mycenaean Greeks, remained mysterious until the 20th century. How many other scripts are we still unable to read? How many texts sit in museums, their meaning locked away? And even if you can read the words, you might not understand the meaning. Technical knowledge is especially vulnerable to this. A text might describe a mechanism, but without hands-on experience building similar mechanisms, the description is just words. You need context. You need tacit knowledge. The kind of knowledge that lives in your fingers, in your intuitions, in your sense of how materials behave and mechanisms move. That kind of knowledge can't really be written down. It has to be transmitted person to person, master to apprentice, teacher to student. When that chain of transmission breaks, the written text becomes harder to interpret. You might know what the words say, but not what they mean. Let me give you an example. Vitruvius was a Roman architect and engineer who lived in the 1st century BCE. He wrote a treatise called De Architectura, which covers architecture, engineering, urban planning, and various other topics. It is one of the most complete technical manuals to survive from ancient Rome. In one section, Vitruvius describes a device called an odometer, a machine for measuring distances traveled by a cart. He explains that it uses a gear mechanism connected to the cart's wheels. Each time the wheel makes a complete revolution, it advances a gear, which advances another gear, which eventually drops a pebble into a container. By counting the pebbles, you can calculate the distance traveled. The description is reasonably clear. Renaissance engineers, who read Vitruvius carefully and tried to reconstruct his devices, built working odometers based on his text. So far, so good. But here's the thing. Vitruvius's description is also incomplete. He doesn't specify the gear ratios. He doesn't explain how to calibrate the device for different wheel sizes. He doesn't mention problems that might arise in practice gear slippage, wear, accumulated error. He assumes that his readers already understand the basics of gear mechanisms. He is writing for people who have hands-on experience with this kind of engineering. For readers who don't have that background, the text is much harder to use. Renaissance engineers made it work, but only because they had their own engineering knowledge to fill in the gaps. If the text had been the only surviving evidence of ancient gear technology, it would have been much more difficult to interpret. Now multiply this problem across hundreds of texts, many of them fragmentary, many of them copies of copies with errors accumulated over centuries of transcription. Ancient technical knowledge becomes a puzzle with missing pieces. You can make progress. You can reconstruct a lot, but there is always uncertainty. The Antikythera Mechanism is a perfect example. When it was first discovered, no one knew what it was. Even after Price's analysis in the 1970s, many details remain mysterious. It took until 2006, when a team of researchers used advanced X-ray tomography to image the mechanism in unprecedented detail, to read the inscriptions on its surfaces and understand its full functionality. Those inscriptions were crucial. They were a kind of user manual, explaining what the mechanism was for and how to interpret its displays. Without them, the gears alone would have been much harder to understand. But the inscriptions were nearly illegible. Corroded, obscured, fragmentary. It took modern technology to read ancient writing. What if the inscriptions had been completely lost? What if the mechanism had been even more corroded? We might still be arguing about whether it was really ancient, or what it was supposed to do, or whether the gears were just coincidental corrosion patterns. Knowledge would have been lost, not because the artifact was destroyed, but because it couldn't be interpreted. This is why documentation matters so much, and why the loss of ancient libraries was so catastrophic. The Library of Alexandria is the famous one, but let's be honest, we don't actually know that much about its destruction. The popular story is that it was burned by Julius Caesar, or by Christian mobs, or by Arab conquerors. In reality, the library's decline was probably gradual. Funding was cut. Scholars left for other cities. Collections were dispersed. The final destruction, whenever it happened, was just the end of a long decline. But Alexandria wasn't the only library that was lost. The ancient world had many libraries. Pergamum had a famous one. So did Athens. Rome had several, both public and private. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad held vast collections. None of them survive intact. All of them lost manuscripts that can never be recovered. And it is not just libraries. Private collections were lost. Workshop notes were lost. The informal exchanges of knowledge between craftsmen. None of that was ever written down at all. It just vanished when the people who held it died. I think about this a lot. About all the things that people knew, that nobody thought to write down, that are now irretrievably gone. The specific techniques for working a particular type of bronze. The optimal settings for a particular kind of kiln. The tricks that made a mechanism run smoothly. All of it, absorbed into the silence of the past. Some of it was probably never lost, just reinvented independently by later generations who faced the same problems. Some of it might still be recoverable through careful archaeology or experimental reconstruction, but some of it is simply gone. And the thing is, this isn't just a problem with ancient technology. Knowledge loss happens in modern times too. There is a famous example involving NASA. In the 1960s and 1970s, NASA sent astronauts to the moon. They built the Saturn V rocket, one of the most powerful machines ever constructed. And then they stopped building it. Decades later, when NASA considered returning to the moon, they discovered that recreating the Saturn V would be difficult. The original blueprints still existed, but the manufacturing processes had changed. The companies that made the components had gone out of business or switched to different technologies. The engineers who knew the tricks, who understood why certain decisions were made, who could troubleshoot problems that weren't documented, they had retired or died. NASA could probably build another Saturn V if they really needed to. But it would take significant effort to reconstruct the tacit knowledge that made the original program work. And this is within living memory, with extensively documented technology, in a society with unprecedented archival capabilities. Imagine how much harder it is to reconstruct the knowledge of engineers who lived 2,000 years ago. Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Let's talk about some specific examples of lost mechanical knowledge. Things we know existed, but can't fully explain. The Antikythera Mechanism is the most dramatic example, but it is not the only one. There are other artifacts, other references, other hints of ancient mechanical sophistication that we don't fully understand. Let's talk about the Baghdad Battery. In 1936, an Austrian archaeologist named Wilhelm König was working at the Iraq Museum in Baghdad when he noticed something unusual among the artifacts. It was a clay jar, about 15 centimeters tall, with a copper cylinder inside. Inside the copper cylinder was an iron rod, held in place by an asphalt plug at the top. König proposed that this was an ancient galvanic cell, a battery. If you filled the jar with an acidic solution, like vinegar or grape juice, a chemical reaction would occur between the copper and the set iron, producing a small electrical current. The asphalt plug would seal the top and prevent evaporation. König dated the artifact to the Parthian period, around 250 BCE to 224 CE. If he was right, this would be evidence of electrochemistry nearly 2,000 years before Alessandro Volta's famous experiments. What would ancient people use a battery for? The most common theory is electroplating. You can use an electric current to deposit a thin layer of metal onto another surface. Ancient gilding techniques might have used this method. There is some archaeological evidence of unusually thin and uniform gold plating on certain ancient artifacts, which is hard to explain with other methods. But here is the thing. We don't actually know if the Baghdad battery was a battery. Kötig's interpretation is plausible, but not proven. The artifact was removed from its original context. We don't know exactly where it was found or what it was associated with. The dating is uncertain. No ancient texts mention anything that sounds like electrochemistry. The whole theory is based on one artifact. And a lot of speculation. It might be a battery. It might be a storage vessel for scrolls. It might be something else entirely. This is the frustrating thing about ancient technology. We have fragments. We have hints. We don't have complete pictures. The Baghdad battery might represent a whole tradition of electrochemical knowledge, passed down through generations of craftsmen, eventually forgotten. Or it might be nothing at all. Let's talk about another mystery. Roman concrete. The Romans built structures that have lasted 2,000 years. The Pantheon in Rome still has its original concrete dome, and it is still the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world. Roman harbors, built in seawater, have remained intact for millennia. Modern concrete often starts to crumble within decades. What made Roman concrete so durable? Modern researchers have been studying this question for years. The basic ingredients are known: volcanic ash pyte, lime, and seawater. But the exact proportions, the preparation methods, the curing processes, these are harder to reconstruct. Recent research suggests that the secret might be in the interaction between lime and seawater. When Roman concrete was exposed to seawater, it triggered a chemical reaction that created mineral crystals within the concrete. These crystals reinforced the structure, making it stronger over time. Modern concrete, by contrast, is damaged by seawater exposure. This is a case where ancient knowledge wasn't completely lost. We have Vitruvius's descriptions. We have archaeological evidence. We can analyze the chemical composition of surviving concrete. But even with all that, it took modern science to understand why Roman concrete was so effective. The ancient builders probably didn't know the chemistry. They just knew that this formula worked, because their predecessors had used it and it had lasted. That is tacit knowledge again. Knowledge embedded in practice, passed down through doing, not easily captured in words. Let's talk about one more mystery: Damascus steel. Damascus steel was a type of steel used for sword blades in the Middle East and South Asia, from around the 3rd century CE to the 18th century. It was famous for its distinctive wavy pattern, called a water or ladder pattern, and for its exceptional hardness and sharpness. Blades made from Damascus steel could supposedly cut through European swords, slice falling silk scarves, and hold an edge indefinitely. How much of this is legend and how much is reality? That is hard to say. Some of the stories are probably exaggerated, but there is no question that Damascus steel had unusual properties. Modern analysis has found that some Damascus steel blades contain carbon nanotubes and nanowires, structures that weren't intentionally created by modern science until the 20th century. How did ancient smiths create these nanostructures? They didn't know about nanotechnology. They didn't have electron microscopes. They were working with techniques passed down through generations of trial and error. Somehow, the specific combination of materials and processes they used produced results that we can barely explain with modern science. And then, sometime in the 18th century, the tradition died out. The last smiths who knew how to make true Damascus steel passed away without passing on their knowledge. The specific ores they used may have been depleted. The supply chains that brought materials together may have been disrupted. Whatever the reason, the knowledge was lost. Modern metallurgists have tried to recreate Damascus steel. They've had partial success, but no one has fully replicated the original material. We can see what it was. We can analyze its structure. We can't quite make it ourselves. There is something humbling about that. For all our technology, all our science, all our accumulated knowledge, there are still things that ancient craftsmen could do that we can't fully reproduce. Let's float back to the Antikythera mechanism for a moment. When researchers analyzed the mechanism in 2006, they discovered something remarkable. The gear ratios in the mechanism were designed to model the metonic cycle, the 19-year period after which the phases of the moon repeat on the same calendar dates. They also found evidence that the mechanism could predict eclipses using the Saros cycle, an 18-year pattern of solar and lunar eclipses. But perhaps most surprising was the discovery that the mechanism may have included gearing to model the motion of the planets. Specifically, the irregular motion of the planets as seen from Earth. This is where it gets complicated. Planets don't move smoothly across the sky. They sometimes appear to slow down, stop, and move backward, a phenomenon called retrograde motion. Ancient astronomers knew about this. They developed elaborate theories to explain it, involving epicycles and deference and other mathematical constructions. The Antikythera mechanism may have mechanically modeled these irregular motions. Using gears, in bronze, 2,000 years ago. We're not entirely sure because the mechanism is incomplete. Some gears are missing. Some inscriptions are illegible, but the evidence suggests that whoever designed the mechanism had an extremely sophisticated understanding of both astronomy and mechanical engineering. They could translate abstract mathematical models into working gear trains. Who was this person? We don't know. The mechanism has no signature, no maker's mark. Some scholars have suggested it might be connected to the tradition of Archimedes, the famous mathematician and engineer who lived in Syracuse in the 3rd century BCE. Ancient sources mention that Archimedes built mechanical models of the heavens planetariums, essentially, that showed the movements of celestial bodies. Could the Antikythera mechanism be a descendant of Archimedes' devices? Maybe. Or maybe it came from a completely different tradition that we know nothing about. Maybe there was a whole school of mechanical astronomy, with multiple workshops producing devices like this, and the Antikythera mechanism is just the one that happened to survive. We might never know. The sea keeps its secrets. Let's step back and think about what all this means. We've been talking about ancient machines as isolated artifacts. The Antikythera mechanism, the Baghdad battery, Damascus steel. Each one is treated as a puzzle to be solved, a mystery to be explained. But ancient engineers didn't see their work that way. They weren't creating mysteries. They were solving practical problems within their own cultural context. Understanding that context is crucial, and it is often what we're missing. Take the Antikythera Mechanism again. Why would someone build such a complex device? Modern people tend to assume it must have been for science, for astronomy, for research, for understanding the universe. But ancient Greeks didn't necessarily separate science from religion the way we do. Astronomical knowledge in the ancient world was intimately connected to religion and ritual. The movements of the sun, moon, and planets were signs from the gods. Eclipses were omens. The calendar was a sacred thing, determining when festivals should be held and sacrifices made. Predicting celestial events wasn't just an intellectual exercise. It was religiously and politically important. The Antikythera Mechanism might have been a tool for priests, or for rulers who wanted to demonstrate their connection to the cosmic order, or for wealthy collectors who wanted to show off their sophistication, or for all of these purposes at once. Similarly, Hero of Alexandria's automatic temple doors weren't just clever gadgets. They were religious technology. They created the appearance of divine intervention, reinforcing the authority of the temples and the priests who operated them. The boundary between engineering and theology was blurry. When we lose the cultural context, we lose the meaning. The gears become just gears. The mechanisms become just mechanisms. We can describe what they did, but we lose why they mattered to the people who made them. This is another kind of knowledge loss. Not the loss of technical information, but the loss of significance. And it is just as important. Let's think about this from another angle. Ancient engineers weren't working alone. They were embedded in networks of craftsmen, patrons, suppliers, and users. They depended on miners who extracted copper and tin, smelters who combined them into bronze, merchants who transported materials, patrons who paid for commissions, apprentices who assisted with construction, users who operated and maintained the finished devices. When any part of this network failed, the whole system became vulnerable. If a particular copper mine was exhausted, if a particular trade route was disrupted, if a particular patron lost interest or money, any of these could derail a project. And if the disruption lasted long enough, the skills themselves could atrophy. The chain of knowledge transmission could break. This is what happened in many places after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. The political and economic infrastructure that supported sophisticated craft production fragmented. Trade networks collapsed. Cities depopulated. Patronage dried up. Craftsmen who couldn't find work couldn't train apprentices. Skills that had been developed over centuries were lost in a generation or two. It is not that medieval Europeans were stupid or backward. They simply lacked the institutional support that ancient engineers had enjoyed. When that support returned, when cities grew again, when trade networks revived, when patrons began commissioning sophisticated works, engineering knowledge began to recover. But it had to be rebuilt, often from scratch. The Islamic Golden Age is a good example of what institutional support could achieve. The caliphs invested in scholarship. They built libraries and academies. They sponsored translations and research. They created an environment where engineers could work, teach, and pass on their knowledge. And the results were spectacular. When that support was withdrawn, when the Mongols sacked Baghdad, when the political order fragmented, when patronage dried up, the results were equally dramatic. Knowledge was lost. Institutions crumbled. Traditions were broken. This pattern repeats throughout history. Knowledge flourishes when institutions support it. Knowledge decays when institutions fail. It is not just about individual genius. It is about the social and economic structures that allow genius to express itself. Modern societies have built institutions specifically designed to preserve knowledge. Universities, archives, museums, journals, patent offices, scientific societies. These institutions are far from perfect, but they represent a concerted effort to prevent knowledge loss, to ensure that what one generation learns is available to the next. Ancient societies had some of these institutions: the Library of Alexandria, the House of Wisdom. But they were more fragile, less redundant, more dependent on the favor of particular rulers. When those rulers changed, when priorities shifted, when wars disrupted, the institutions could fail. I wonder sometimes what future historians will think of us. Will they look at our technology and marvel, the way we marvel at the Antikythera Mechanism? Will they find our silicon chips and wonder how we made them? Will they puzzle over our nuclear reactors and our gene sequencers and our quantum computers? Or will our knowledge survive? Will the redundancy of our archives, physical and digital, scattered across continents, be enough to preserve what we know through whatever disruptions the future brings? I don't know. I hope so. But I am aware that every previous civilization thought their achievements would last forever, and most of them were wrong. Let's move on to something a little lighter. Let's talk about the rediscovery of ancient knowledge. The European Renaissance is often described as a rediscovery of classical antiquity. That is an oversimplification, but there is truth in it. After centuries in which ancient Greek and Roman texts were neglected, poorly copied, or simply lost, European scholars began systematically seeking them out. The fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks in 1453 accelerated this process. Greek scholars fleeing the city brought manuscripts with them to Italy. Libraries that had preserved ancient texts for centuries suddenly became accessible to Western European scholars. A whole literary and philosophical tradition that had been partially forgotten was suddenly available again. But it wasn't just literature and philosophy. Technical texts were rediscovered too. Vitruvius's De Architectura, which had survived in medieval copies, was printed for the first time in 1486. Hero of Alexandria's Pneumatica was translated into Latin in the 16th century. Archimedes' mathematical works, preserved through Arabic and Byzantine transmission, became widely available. Renaissance engineers studied these texts eagerly. They weren't just interested in theoretical knowledge. They wanted to build things. Leonardo da Vinci, the most famous Renaissance polymath, filled notebooks with designs for machines, many of them inspired by ancient sources. He studied gear mechanisms, hydraulic systems, flying machines, military devices. He was trying to understand what the ancients had done and to surpass them. Some of his designs were practical. Some were fantastical. Some were probably impossible with the technology of his time, but the impulse was clear to recover and extend ancient mechanical knowledge. Other engineers were more practically oriented. Filippo Brunelleschi, who designed the dome of Florence Cathedral, invented new hoisting machines to lift materials to unprecedented heights. He studied Roman construction techniques. The Pantheon was his inspiration, and found ways to adapt them to his own projects. His dome remains one of the greatest engineering achievements of the Renaissance. But here is the interesting thing. Renaissance engineers didn't just copy ancient designs. They improved on them. They had access to better materials, better tools, and several centuries of medieval craft development that the ancient world had lacked. Clockwork is a good example. The ancient world had water clocks and some gear mechanisms. But the mechanical clock driven by weights and regulated by an escapement was a medieval European invention developed around the 13th century. Renaissance clockmakers refined this technology, making clocks smaller, more accurate, and more complex. The precision clockwork of the 16th and 17th centuries was something genuinely new, not just a revival of ancient knowledge. Similarly, printing with movable type was a medieval invention that transformed the transmission of knowledge. The printing press made it possible to produce identical copies of texts quickly and cheaply. Errors that accumulated through hand copying could be corrected in new editions. Knowledge became more durable, more distributed, more resistant to loss. The scientific revolution of the 17th century built on both ancient knowledge and medieval innovations. Galileo studied mechanics and astronomy using methods that combined ancient theory with new experimental approaches. Newton synthesized ancient geometry with new calculus. The Royal Society and other scientific academies institutionalized the sharing of knowledge in ways that ancient societies had only approximated. By the 18th century, European engineering had surpassed anything the ancient world had achieved. The steam engine, developed by Thomas Newcomen and improved by James Watt, was more powerful and practical than Hero's Eolipoli could ever have been. The Industrial Revolution was beginning. But let's not get too triumphalist here. The rediscovery narrative can be misleading. It implies that ancient knowledge was simply waiting to be found, that all we had to do was dust off the old texts and pick up where the ancients left off. That is not quite right. Much ancient knowledge was genuinely lost. We can read Vitruvius, but we can't fully replicate Roman concrete. We can analyze Damascus steel, but we can't make it ourselves. We have the Antikythera Mechanism, but we don't know who built it or what other devices they made. And the rediscovery wasn't inevitable. It required institutions willing to support scholarship, patrons willing to fund research, political stability that allowed scholars to work. If any of those conditions had failed, and they did fail in many places and times, the rediscovery would have been slower or never happened at all. The Renaissance happened in Europe, not everywhere. Other civilizations had their own trajectories, their own achievements, their own losses and recoveries. The story of knowledge is not a simple upward progression. It is a tangled web of advances and setbacks, preservation and loss, rediscovery and reinvention. Okay, let's take another moment here. You are doing well, still comfortable, still relaxed. We've come a long way, from Greek sponge divers to Chinese clock towers, to Islamic automata, from the frustrations of lost knowledge to the slow work of recovery. Let me bring it back to the beginning, to the Antikythera Mechanism and what it represents. The title of tonight's exploration is The Lost Blueprints, Decoding the Language of Ancient Machine Builders. I've been circling around that phrase, the language of machine builders, and I want to address it directly now. What does it mean to have a language of machine building? It means more than just technical vocabulary, though that is part of it. Every craft has its specialized terms, its names for tools and materials and processes. A gear is a gear. A lever is a lever. But knowing the words isn't the same as knowing the language. The language of machine building is a way of thinking. It is an understanding of how forces flow through mechanisms, how motion can be transformed and redirected, how simple elements combine into complex systems. It is intuition about what will work and what won't, developed through years of practice and teaching. It is also a set of shared assumptions. Ancient Greek engineers had certain ways of approaching problems that differed from Chinese engineers, or Islamic engineers. Not better or worse, just different. They used different tools, different materials, different mathematical frameworks. They had different aesthetics, different priorities, different constraints. When we try to decode ancient mechanisms, we're not just reverse engineering physical objects. We're trying to reconstruct a way of thinking that was never explicitly documented. The gears tell us what the mechanism did. They don't tell us why the builder made specific choices. They don't tell us what alternatives were considered and rejected. They don't tell us what problems arose during construction and how they were solved. This is the deepest kind of knowledge loss. Not the forgetting of facts, but the forgetting of frameworks. The loss of the mental models that allowed ancient engineers to conceive of their devices in the first place. Modern researchers have tried to address this through experimental archaeology. They build replicas of ancient mechanisms, using ancient techniques and materials as closely as possible. The process of building reveals things that analysis alone cannot. You discover what is hard and what is easy, where the tolerances matter, what problems the ancient builders must have faced. Replicas of the Antikythera Mechanism have been built. They work, the gears turn, the dials display the celestial cycles. But the builders of those replicas learned things from the process that they couldn't have learned just from studying the original. They began to understand dimly What the ancient makers knew. This is one way of recovering lost knowledge. Not complete recovery. You can never fully reconstruct a lost tradition, but partial recovery, approximate recovery. Good enough to build something that works, even if you can't be sure you are doing it the same way the ancients did. The other way is through careful analysis of surviving texts. This is where the work becomes really painstaking. Ancient technical texts are often frustrating to read. They assume knowledge that their original readers would have had. But we don't. They use terms that may have meant something specific to ancient craftsmen, but are vague to us. They describe processes without explaining the reasoning behind them. Al-Jazari's book of ingenious devices is unusually complete. He provides diagrams. He specifies materials. He explains how the mechanisms work. But even so, scholars who have tried to build replicas from his descriptions have found gaps, things he didn't mention because they were obvious to him. Skills he assumed his readers possessed. Closing those gaps requires inference, guesswork, trial and error. You try something. It doesn't work. You try something else. Gradually, through iteration, you converge on something that functions. But you can never be entirely sure you've converged on the right answer. This is decoding, not in the sense of cryptography, breaking a code to reveal a hidden message, more like archaeology, piecing together fragments to reconstruct a partial picture. You work with what you have. You accept uncertainty. You stay humble about what you don't know. The language of ancient machine builders is partially lost. Some words survive. Some grammar survives. But fluency, that is probably gone forever. We can learn to read the language haltingly, with dictionaries and grammars pieced together from fragments. We cannot speak it as a native. And yet, there is something beautiful about the attempt, about the effort to reach across millennia and understand what people knew, about the humility of admitting our ignorance while still striving to learn. The Antikythera Mechanism sat in a museum for decades before anyone understood what it was. It took new technology, X-ray imaging, computer analysis, to reveal its secrets. Who knows what other secrets are hidden in artifacts we've already found? What mechanisms are sitting in storage rooms, waiting for someone to look at them with the right tools and the right questions? Who knows what is still buried? In shipwrecks, in tombs, in ruins we haven't excavated yet. The past keeps yielding surprises. Every decade brings new discoveries that reshape our understanding of what ancient people could do. The lost blueprints aren't entirely lost. Fragments remain, clues remain, and the work of decoding continues. Slowly, patiently, one puzzle piece at a time. We've been at this for a while now. If you are still awake, I appreciate your company. If you've drifted off, that is fine too. That is what this is for. Let me leave you with one final thought. The machines of the ancient world are gone. Most of them. Rusted, rotted, melted down, thrown away. The people who built them are gone too. Their names mostly unremembered. Their lives unknown. But something of what they knew persists. In the fragments we've found. In the texts we've preserved. In the traditions we've inherited. Changed and changed again through generations of transmission. Every modern machine has ancestors. The computer you are listening to this on, the car you drive, the clock on your wall, all of them descend through long and tangled lineages from devices built by people who lived thousands of years ago. Those ancient engineers were trying to solve problems, make things move, measure time, amaze their patrons, understand the heavens. The specific problems have changed, but the impulse hasn't. We're still building machines, still trying to make sense of the world, still passing our knowledge to the next generation and hoping they'll do something good with it. The language of machine building isn't really lost. It is evolving. What Hero of Alexandria knew isn't what Al-Jazari knew, isn't what Leonardo knew, isn't what modern engineers know. But there is a continuity, a conversation across time, conducted through devices and drawings and texts. The Antikythera Mechanism is a word in that conversation. A complicated, beautiful, still not fully understood word, and we're still listening. Okay, that is enough for tonight. I hope this has been relaxing. I hope if you are trying to sleep that you are well on your way. And I hope if you are interested in ancient technology that you've found something to think about. Take care of yourselves. Good night. But since we're here, and the night is still long for those who aren't yet sleeping, let's continue a while longer. There is more to say. There always is. Let's talk about the philosophy behind ancient mechanics. Not just what they built, but how they thought about what they were building. The Greeks had a word, techne. It is usually translated as art, or craft, or skill, but none of those really capture it. Techne was systematic knowledge that could be taught and learned. It was the know-how that lets you make things, pots, ships, houses, mechanisms. It was distinguished from episteme, which was theoretical knowledge, knowledge of why things are the way they are. Aristotle, who had opinions about everything, thought that techne was inferior to episteme. Practical knowledge was fine for craftsmen, but true wisdom lay in understanding first principles. This attitude, that theory trumps practice, that intellectuals are superior to artisans, had lasting effects on how Greek society valued different kinds of work. Engineers and craftsmen were respected, but they weren't at the top of the social hierarchy. Philosophers were, politicians were, generals were. The people who actually made things were somewhere in the middle, useful, but not particularly prestigious. This may help explain why so few ancient engineers are known by name. Ctesibius is barely a historical figure. We know almost nothing about his life. Hero of Alexandria is better documented, but only because his writings survived. The actual builders of the Antikythera Mechanism are completely anonymous. Their work was valued, but not enough to record who they were. Contrast this with how we remember ancient philosophers. We have biographies of Plato and Aristotle. We know where they taught, who their students were, what they argued about over dinner. Their words were copied and preserved with care. Engineers didn't get the same treatment. This is a bias in the historical record. It doesn't mean engineering was unimportant. The existence of devices like the Antikythera Mechanism proves it was. It means that the people who wrote history didn't think engineering was as worth writing about as philosophy or politics or war. We're still dealing with the consequences of that bias today. We have extensive records of what Greek philosophers thought about the nature of reality. We have fragmentary, incomplete records of what Greek engineers actually built. Let's think about this another way. Archimedes is one of the few ancient engineers who became genuinely famous. He is remembered for discovering the principle of buoyancy, that thing with the bathtub and shouting, "Eureka!" He is remembered for calculating pi to unprecedented precision. He is remembered for the Archimedean screw, a device for raising water that is still used today. But Archimedes was also, according to ancient sources, a prolific builder of mechanical devices. He supposedly built war machines that defended Syracuse against the Roman siege. Cranes that could lift ships out of the water, catapults of unprecedented power. Perhaps even a heat ray using focused mirrors. How much of this is true? Hard to say. Ancient sources loved a good story, and stories about Archimedes grew more elaborate over time. But the basic claim that Archimedes was a brilliant practical engineer, as well as a theoretical mathematician, is probably accurate. And here is the thing. Archimedes himself apparently valued his theoretical work more than his practical work. According to Plutarch, Archimedes considered engineering to be unworthy of serious intellectual effort. He built machines when his king asked him to, but his real passion was pure mathematics. Whether this is accurate, or whether it is Plutarch projecting later attitudes onto Archimedes, we can't be sure. But it reflects a tension in ancient thought between theory and practice, between understanding the world and changing it. Modern science has largely resolved this tension. We now recognize that theory and practice inform each other. You can't understand combustion without building engines. You can't build better engines without understanding combustion. The boundary between scientist and engineer has blurred. But for the ancients, this boundary was sharper, and it may have limited how far their engineering could develop. If practical knowledge wasn't valued, if engineers weren't encouraged to write down what they knew, if the brightest minds were directed toward philosophy rather than mechanics, then the accumulated knowledge of centuries remained fragile, dependent on oral transmission and apprenticeship, vulnerable to disruption. I am speculating here. We don't have enough evidence to know for certain how ancient engineering education worked. But the pattern of knowledge loss suggests that transmission was precarious. Too much depended on individuals, too little was systematically documented. Modern engineering addresses this differently. We have technical journals, standards organizations, textbooks that are updated with each generation's innovations, patents that require inventors to describe their methods in detail, professional societies that share knowledge across institutions and borders. None of these are perfect. Knowledge still gets lost. Trade secrets die with their inventors. Companies go bankrupt and take their expertise with them. Digital formats become obsolete. But the redundancy is much greater. The loss of any single document or person doesn't doom an entire field. Ancient engineering didn't have this redundancy. A single fire could destroy a library. A single plague could kill the craftsman who knew how to build a particular device. A single war could disperse an engineering tradition across continents. And that is largely what happened. Let's shift our attention to Rome for a while. The Romans are often characterized as practical rather than theoretical. They built roads and aqueducts and bridges. But they didn't produce many famous philosophers or mathematicians. They took Greek knowledge and applied it. They were engineers, not scientists. This is a stereotype, and like most stereotypes, it is partly true and partly misleading. The Romans did build remarkable infrastructure. The Roman road network stretched across 3 continents. Roman aqueducts carried water over vast distances, using gradients so precise that some of them are still functional today. Roman concrete, as we discussed, was extraordinarily durable. But the Romans also engaged in theoretical work, just less famously than the Greeks. Vitruvius, whom we've mentioned several times, was a theoretical thinker as well as a practical engineer. His De Architectura includes philosophical discussions about the education of architects, the nature of beauty, and the relationship between art and nature. The Roman military used sophisticated engineering. Siege engines, fortifications, naval technology, all required careful design and construction. Julius Caesar's bridge across the Rhine, built in 10 days during his campaign against the Germanic tribes, was a marvel of field engineering. The Romans were perfectly capable of innovation when military necessity demanded it, but the Roman approach to knowledge was different from the Greek approach. The Romans were more interested in synthesis than original research. They collected and organized knowledge. They created encyclopedias. Pliny the Elder's Natural History, written in the 1st century CE, attempted to summarize all the knowledge of the natural world in a single work. This encyclopedic tendency was both a strength and a weakness. On one hand, it produced comprehensive reference works that preserved knowledge from earlier sources. On the other hand, it sometimes prioritized breadth over depth, copying information without fully understanding it. Pliny himself is a good example. He was a voracious reader and compiler, but not always a careful one. His natural history contains accurate information alongside obvious errors and fables. He recorded what his sources said without always checking whether it was true. The result is a fascinating but unreliable guide to ancient knowledge. For mechanical engineering specifically, Roman texts are frustrating. We have Vitruvius, but his descriptions of machines are often vague. We have references to machines in other texts, cranes, water mills, automata for theatrical performances, but rarely detailed technical information. The Romans clearly had sophisticated engineering knowledge. Their buildings prove it. Their infrastructure proves it. But they didn't leave behind the kind of detailed technical treatises that the Greeks' Hero, Ctesibius, or the Islamic engineers, Al-Jazari, the Banu Musa produced. Maybe such treatises existed and were lost. Maybe the Romans transmitted their engineering knowledge primarily through apprenticeship and practice rather than writing. Maybe the texts that survived are simply not representative of what was originally available. We don't know. What we do know is that when the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century CE, much of this engineering knowledge collapsed with it. The infrastructure that had supported complex craft production broke down. Cities contracted. Trade networks fragmented. The institutional support that had allowed Roman engineering to flourish disappeared. Medieval Europe retained some Roman knowledge, enough to build cathedrals and castles, to maintain some manufacturing traditions, to keep basic technologies alive, but the level of sophistication declined. Roman concrete was forgotten. Large-scale engineering projects became rare. The kind of mechanical complexity represented by the Antikythera Mechanism was not seen again in Europe for centuries. The Islamic world, by contrast, preserved and extended ancient engineering knowledge during this period. The translation movement brought Greek and Roman texts into Arabic. Engineers like the Banu Musa and Al-Jazari built on these traditions. The contrast between medieval European and medieval Islamic engineering is striking. This is why the Renaissance, when it came, involved so much interaction with Islamic sources. European scholars sought out Arabic translations of Greek texts. They learned from Islamic engineers and scientists. The recovery of ancient knowledge in Europe was partly mediated through the Islamic world. History is complicated. Knowledge flows in multiple directions. Traditions blend and diverge. There is no single story of progress or decline, just overlapping cycles of accumulation and loss. We've talked a lot about Greece, China, and the Islamic world, but India deserves attention too, especially when it comes to astronomical knowledge. Indian astronomy has ancient roots, stretching back to the Vedic period more than 3,000 years ago. Early Indian astronomical texts focused on timing religious rituals and tracking the lunar calendar. But by the classical period, Indian astronomers were developing sophisticated mathematical models of celestial motion. The greatest of the classical Indian astronomers was Aryabhata, who lived in the 5th and 6th centuries CE. His treatise, the Aryabhatya, presented a mathematical model of the solar system that was remarkably accurate. He calculated the length of the year to within a few minutes of the modern value. He proposed that the Earth rotates on its axis, explaining the apparent motion of the stars. Aryabhata's work influenced later Indian astronomers, including Brahmagupta and Bhaskara II. It also influenced Islamic astronomy. The Arabic translation movement included Indian texts alongside Greek ones. The decimal number system that we use today, including the concept of zero, came to Europe from India via the Islamic world. Did Indian astronomers build mechanical devices to model celestial motion? This is less clear. Indian texts focus primarily on mathematical calculations rather than mechanical implementation. There is no Indian equivalent of the Antikythera Mechanism that we know of. But absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Indian craft traditions were sophisticated. Metalworking was highly developed. It is possible that mechanical astronomical instruments existed and were simply not documented, or that the documentation was lost. What we do know is that Indian astronomers developed mathematical tools, including trigonometry and early forms of calculus, that were essential for precise astronomical calculation. Whether these tools were ever implemented in mechanical form, we can't say. This is another example of what we don't know outweighing what we do. Indian civilization was vast and complex, spanning thousands of years and a subcontinent. Our knowledge of its technical traditions is fragmentary. There is surely much more to learn. Let me try to pull some threads together here. We've surveyed mechanical traditions from multiple civilizations: Greek pneumatics, Chinese clockwork, Islamic automata, Roman infrastructure. Each developed its own approaches, its own techniques, its own solutions to the problems of making things move. And yet these traditions weren't entirely isolated. Ideas flowed along trade routes. Technologies were borrowed and adapted. The silk that traveled from China to Rome, the spices that traveled from India to the Mediterranean. Alongside these physical goods, knowledge traveled too. The Silk Road wasn't just a trade route. It was an information highway. Merchants and travelers carried stories about wonders they'd seen. Craftsmen sometimes traveled too, bringing their skills to new markets. Religious missionaries spread texts and teachings. Diplomatic embassies exchanged gifts that demonstrated technological prowess. We know, for example, that Byzantine emperors sent mechanical automata as diplomatic gifts. In the 10th century, the Emperor Constantine VII possessed a throne room equipped with mechanical lions that roared, birds that sang, and a throne that could be raised toward the ceiling. Visiting dignitaries were meant to be awed by these displays of sophisticated technology. Did some of this Byzantine knowledge derive from earlier Greek or Roman sources? Probably. Did it influence Islamic engineering? Possibly. The connections are tangled and hard to trace. Similarly, Chinese technologies sometimes traveled westward. The silk loom, with its complex pattern weaving mechanisms, influenced textile production across Eurasia. The magnetic compass, invented in China, eventually reached Europe and revolutionized navigation. But transmission wasn't just copying. Technologies were adapted to new contexts, modified to suit different materials and needs, combined with local innovations. What emerged on the receiving end was never identical to what had been sent. This is how knowledge evolves, not through simple preservation, but through transmission and transformation. Each generation receives something from the past, changes it, and passes on something new to the future. The lineage is real, but so is the innovation. The machines we build today are descended from ancient machines, but they're not the same. We've added things. We've discarded things. We've solved problems that the ancients couldn't solve. And in doing so, we've sometimes forgotten how they solved the problems they faced. Knowledge flows forward, but not everything makes the journey. Each generation chooses, consciously or unconsciously, what to keep and what to let go. The Antikythera Mechanism was not preserved. The tradition that produced it was not preserved. What survived was something else. Different texts, different devices, a different set of choices about what was worth remembering. This is not a tragedy, exactly. It is just how history works. Every present moment is a bottleneck through which only some of the past can pass. We inherit what fit through the bottleneck. The rest is lost. As we near the end of tonight's journey, let me try to summarize what we've covered. We began with the Antikythera Mechanism, a lump of corroded bronze that turned out to be the most sophisticated mechanical device known from antiquity. It showed that ancient engineers could build precision gear mechanisms capable of modeling complex astronomical cycles. It showed that there was a tradition of mechanical knowledge, now largely lost, that produced such devices. We explored the engineers of Alexandria, Ctesibius, Hero, and others, who developed pneumatics, hydraulics, and automata. We saw that their work was part of a larger tradition that valued mechanical ingenuity, even if that tradition left behind fewer traces than we might wish. We traveled to China and encountered the south-pointing chariot, Susong's clock tower, and a rich tradition of mechanical innovation that developed independently of Greek and Roman traditions. We saw that sophisticated mechanical knowledge existed in multiple civilizations simultaneously. We visited the Islamic Golden Age and met engineers like Al-Jazari, who systematically documented their work in ways that survive to this day. We saw how the translation movement brought together knowledge from multiple traditions, enabling synthesis and innovation. We thought about how knowledge gets lost, through material decay, through disruption of transmission chains, through loss of institutional support, through the failure to document tacit knowledge. We saw that knowledge is fragile, dependent on ongoing effort to preserve it. We thought about how knowledge gets recovered, through rediscovery of texts, through experimental archaeology, through the patient work of decoding fragmentary evidence. We saw that recovery is always partial, always uncertain, always ongoing. And we reflected on what it means to decode the language of ancient machine builders. Not just reverse, engineering physical devices, but reconstructing ways of thinking that were never explicitly written down. Understanding not just what the ancients built, but why they built it and how they thought about what they were doing. What haven't we covered? A lot. This is a vast subject, and we've only scratched the surface. We haven't talked about ancient shipbuilding, which involved sophisticated mechanical elements like pulleys, winches, and steering mechanisms. We haven't talked about ancient mining technology, which used water wheels, pumps, and ventilation system. We haven't talked about textile production, which depended on complex looms and spinning machinery. We haven't talked about the mechanical traditions of Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, or pre-Columbian America, all of which had their own approaches to the problems of making things move, and all of which left behind less documentation than the civilizations we've discussed. We haven't talked about the social history of engineering, who became an engineer, how they were trained, what their working conditions were like, how they were compensated. These questions are important, but the sources are scarce. We've gestured toward the relationship between engineering and religion, but we haven't explored it deeply. Ancient machines were often built for religious purposes, to create the appearance of divine intervention, to track sacred calendars, to demonstrate cosmic order. The separation of technology from religion is a modern phenomenon, and it may distort our understanding of ancient motivations. There is always more to learn. That is the nature of history. The past is immense, and our knowledge of it is limited. Every new discovery changes the picture. Every new technique reveals things that were previously hidden. The Antikythera Mechanism was found in 1901. It wasn't really understood until 2006. What else are we missing? What other secrets are waiting to be decoded? It is late now, or early, depending on your perspective. The kind of hour when thoughts get quiet and the world seems very still. I want to leave you with something to think about as you drift off, or as you go about your day if you are not sleeping. The ancient machine builders are gone. Their names are mostly forgotten. Their devices are mostly destroyed. Their knowledge is mostly lost. And yet, something of them remains. In the texts that survived, in the artifacts that were preserved, in the traditions that were passed down, changed and changed again, but still connected to what came before. Every time someone builds a clock, they're connected to Susong and Ctesibius. Every time someone uses a gear, they're connected to whoever built the Antikythera Mechanism. Every time someone automates a process, they're connected to Hero and Al-Jazari, and all the others who dreamed of machines that could move on their own. The language of machine building isn't fully lost because we're still speaking it. Changed beyond recognition, maybe, but still connected to its origins. Still part of the same conversation that began when the first human realized that a lever could multiply force, that a wheel could reduce friction, that gears could transform motion. We are the inheritors of a tradition that stretches back thousands of years. We didn't invent it. We received it, and we're passing it on. That is worth thinking about. That is worth feeling, maybe. A sense of connection across time. To all the people who worked on these problems before us and will work on them after. The lost blueprints aren't entirely lost. They're written into the machines we use every day. They're encoded in the skills we've inherited. They're implicit in the questions we ask and the solutions we find. And the work of decoding continues, slowly, patiently, one puzzle piece at a time. Okay, that is really it for tonight. Close your eyes if you haven't already. Let your thoughts settle. Let the ancient engineers rest. Tomorrow, the conversation continues. But for now, sleep. Good night.